Are you ready to become a change maker? Our 48-week postgraduate program in public policy or the PGP may be just the thing for you. This hybrid program is designed to give you both the theoretical foundation and hands-on experience needed to excel in policy making. With a mix of expert-led webinars, in-person workshops, and policy simulation exercises, you'll gain real-world skills along with personalized mentorship. Through our policy programs, we connect good people to good ideas and good networks. Apply now at the link in the description to make an impact.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi, welcome to today's episode of All Things Policy. My name's Adya and I'm going to be your host for today. Today, I'm going to be in conversation with our very own economic policy researcher, Miheer Karandikar. And he's going to be talking about some really interesting research he's done very recently, which is on something that impacts almost all of us, I think. It's part of our day-to-day lives. He's going to be talking to us about his work on Indian cities and infrastructure, how to improve them. So yeah, let's dive right into it.
Hi, Adya.
Mihi, thank you for agreeing to speak with me.
Great to be here. Yeah.
So my first question, just to start off, is that I've read a lot about how Indian cities account for a large percentage of its GDP, some 70% if I remember correctly. But they struggle with things such as infrastructure and governance. From an economic standpoint, how do you think we can better leverage our cities as economic engines? Why do they matter? And yeah.
Yeah. So the research that I did kind of fits into the larger, broad areas of generating more jobs for India that Takshashila is looking into, right? They have been doing research into it for some time. So, like you said, Indian cities, or basically cities around the world, create much more jobs, generate a much larger percentage of the GDP than the rural areas or other areas, right? And if you want to create more jobs, if you want to grow more, then you need to use your cities in the best way possible, right? So the economic theory behind cities doing well is they have agglomeration externalities, they have network effects. Workers are more productive there because the means of production, the people who produce land, labor, capital, they are closer together. Transaction costs reduce. Firms develop, etc., etc. Right. So all the cities have like the perfect concoction for better economic growth. And that's why we need to focus on how we can create better jobs in our cities if we want to create better jobs in our country as a whole, right? So like you said, Indian cities account for about 70% of GDP, while only about 37% according to World Bank data people live in Indian cities. So one Indian worker is much more productive than an average rural worker. So the main four areas that I focus on to better Indian city jobs prospects, or the main four problems that Indian cities face while creating jobs, is that the infrastructure in cities is not at par, right? So first we need to better and we need to improve infrastructure, and this can be basic infrastructure like water, sewage and waste management, public transport, housing, roads, schools, and other things like say post office. We can talk about it. I haven't focused a lot on that, but even these basic like water and public transport and sewage, waste, etc. Right, housing. So these are the main things that we need to focus on. The second thing that we need to do to harness those kind of externalities, the agglomeration externalities, is that we need to loosen land use policies, and we need to allow more vertical development in our cities. So colloquially, or even just as a thought experiment, if you have ever seen photos of developed cities in developed countries like New York or even London, what Australian cities or even European cities, and even cities in a little countries that are not as rich, even like Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia or Bangkok, you always see a great skyline, right? These high rises, skyscrapers, that loom large across the horizon, but that's not what you see in most Indian cities. I think Mumbai has a kind of a skyline, but other than that, even Mumbai, the skyline is very limited to one small area. So when you restrict these, this is because land use policies in India are very stringent, that you can't build vertically, you can't build tall, you can't build big buildings on smaller areas. And what this causes is it makes cities bigger geographically, so it makes them expand because more people are always coming to cities, and so they have to live further and further away from the means of production or the wherever they work, etc. And so that causes urban sprawl, and that has a lot of problems. You can't harness those network effects as well, that you need to spend more time, more money in transport, etc., etc. Cost of infrastructure provision increases. So that is the second thing we need to do. This is very specific, but yeah. Then the third thing we need to do is empower local governments. In India, urban governments have very limited powers. They don't have as much, they can't raise money. They don't have enough state capacity to plan, to execute the infrastructure like they want to address the needs of citizens. I think there's a podcast that I did with another guest, of I think a month ago, on the elections are irregular. So in general, local governments are not empowered, especially urban local governments are not empowered in India. State governments control a lot of the decisions that go into urban development. So but when that happens, the pace of development, the way in which urban areas should develop is really from the ground up. That changes, right, when the state government imposes their own objectives or their own agendas to the city. So that we need to kind of decrease, and we need to empower local governments. And the fourth thing that we need to do is related to local governments is better local government finances. This is a very important topic, and this is different from empowering local governments, because we can say that in some cases unempowered local governments, but which have a little more money than they have right now, can still do much better than they are doing right now, right? So local governments have very low ability to raise their own revenue. They don't have the ability to go to the market and gain, to the market and get a lot of money. They don't have the ability to execute like a pipeline of projects, which hinders their ability to give in infrastructure. So I guess this is a chain, right? So the main thing is you need to build more infrastructure. To be able to build more infrastructure in the closed areas, you need to loosen up land use policies, and to be able to understand what this infrastructure is and to provide an infrastructure adequately, provide the money for the infrastructure, you need empowered local governments, and you need to improve their finances. So that's the kind of, as you can say, pipeline of projects that I vouch for to better job creation in Indian cities.
Okay, thanks, Mihi. That was really comprehensive. One follow-up question I had to that was that, like you said, India's infrastructure investment is like still a fraction of what global benchmarks are and what it should be. What
Right.
would you say? You've told us about some ways in which we can address our infrastructural challenges in a broader frame, but what would you say the key bottlenecks are that are preventing adequate investment?
I think so. Yeah, just to give some numbers, right? So, according to I think a McKinsey study or a World Bank study, that Indian cities invest only 0.6%, or India in general invests only 0.6% of its GDP in urban infrastructure. And the estimated requirement is about 1.18%, so about twice as much as we do right now, right? In a per capita kind of comparison, India spends only, so on transport, for example, only $17 per capita on transport in cities every year. And while the benchmark needs for, based on other developing countries or similar countries, stands at about $100 per capita. Um, so this is the like a really poor state of Indian finances. Poor waste management, poor sewage treatment, causes diseases. You might have seen this recent news about the GBS syndrome outbreak in my own city, Pune, which was mainly caused by untreated sewage or untreated water, right? So yeah, so I mean, this is in a city like Pune, which is probably India's top 10 biggest cities. I think this is still a big problem. So these weaknesses really show. The key bottlenecks that you mentioned include, I think, one of them definitely has to be underfinanced urban local bodies. They just don't have the capacity, they just don't have the money, they just don't have the power to invest in infrastructure, even if they know what they want to. Then there's some bit of state government involvement, that a lot of the money that is tied to urban development is with state governments, and then they really choose what they want to do instead of actually addressing the needs of what the city needs. And this can be to not to okay so not to use the word um, flashy, but state governments really tend to focus on these flashy kind of investments, right? So metros or riverfront developments, or but basic things like just untreated sewage or roads is not really focused on. Then there's very really overlapping and complicated codes on development. So in India, the development plans of municipalities are not very detailed. They are very old. They are not revised after every 10 years, 15 years that they need to be. Then they have to be imposed like they are. They can't be changed and they can't evolve. Some of the functions that have been listed in the 73rd, 74th Amendment for urban government bodies are not always controlled by them. There are some of them are also controlled by state governments, and that inevitably goes to them. Yeah, I think these are the main kind of bottlenecks. To solve this, we just need to increase investment. We can, and a good way to do this is using public-private partnerships, right? So to use the power of the private sector to invest in this, and then somehow get them to somehow utilize in this infrastructure to get a return from it. This can be basic like roads. You put tolls on them, or it can be water. You can impose a water tax or water cess, and that gives citizens clean water, and that also gives the private sector some kind of return, right? So um, yeah, this is the kind of a basic tool we can use to improve infrastructure.
Okay, you said metros, you said local bodies trying to put in place metros, and that reminded me. I had a question on public transport. Since Indian cities
Hmm.
are typically car centric, but public transport is still underfunded, what do you think the best models would be for improving our public transport ecosystem? I mean, considering that
Yeah.
this is a challenge within infrastructure that almost directly impacts everyone's day to day life.
Right, right. So, roads and buses and metros are something we really focus on a lot, and still it's underfunded, and still they're not adequate and not enough to provide India's needs. Like the numbers that I quoted just a while ago, that India spends only $17 per capita on its urban transport, where it should spend around $100 per capita. This shows that the public transport has a meager 30% share on an average in Indian cities, while compared to other countries, they can even reach 80%, right? So some of the really good developed countries. So you mentioned metros, right? I think metros is something that the new government is really focusing on. They have been developing new metros in even tier 2, some even tier 3 cities. Of course, the metros, they have been focusing a lot on that, expanding a lot on them. But metros are good, right? So what metros really do is they can move a lot of people from really large distances to from one place to another. Say if there is a residential area, or there are multiple residential areas, and there's one downtown in which you want to move people to, right? The downtown is the place where a lot of people will have to go to work. So instead of everyone getting their own car or getting their own bike, or getting their own transport, they can use these metros, and these metros can carry a bulk of people really far away to a good distance. But that is where their utility kind of stops, right? So they are good when you have to move people over a large distance with a lot of people. However, Indian cities are not as large. Indian or even if some might be, the trips that people take in cities are really close. So in Indian cities, most people live really close to the where they work, and that is the general travel that people do. So there's a very good studies that have been done. So in Delhi, for example, the average ticket for a metro journey cost say 29 rupees, but that for a bus cost 11 rupees, and not everyone can afford that amount of that ticket every day, right? So that is one problem. Metros are really good in moving people along large distances. Buses are really good in moving people along shorter distances, and India needs buses. India does need metros, yes, good metros, we need them, but also buses. And buses are generally ignored at the cost of the metro, right? So even if you look at big cities like London, for example, almost as many people move through buses as do through underground metro rail network, right? So that is something we really need to focus on. And like I said, metros are big, shiny. They are the face of new development. They're the face of the new age or new era, and they are funded by the central government. They're funded by the state government. They use that as like a pet projects of themselves. They fast track them, do this, do that. But buses are this under invested, ignored brother that no one wants to take care of, and they just working away at the sidelines. But buses are as important. In Pune, for example, so sorry, I'm just citing the examples of Pune because I live there. There used to be these big BRTS tracks. So BRTS, bus rapid transport system, where you use a portion of the road just for buses and for ambulances, but basically buses, right? That those networks were demolished and the road was again opened for the general public, right? So there's like kind of you're going away from using more buses, which is not that we should do. BRTS systems work really good in high density areas, in for shorter distances rather than metros, which are used to move people over longer distances. And I think one big problem is in urban planning does not include bus transport. So many cities have development plans 20 years old, 30 years old, which they now have to execute, that include roads, but they don't include the ways in which the city has now proliferated, the ways where population density is high right now, and they don't include, bus stations, they don't include BRTS networks, they don't include stops, which is something that buses really need, right? That you need on the road. Metros you can build on top of roads. But so yeah, so that's something we need to do. Again, doing a public-private partnership is really good. There have been, I think, Bhopal or Indore, and I think Delhi also has experimented with, introducing private buses on, state-operated or state-sanctioned routes, and that really they can generate a return from that. So, and then they really have an incentive to provide, transport. If the municipal corporation or the urban government, whichever it is there, cannot do that, then you can open that to public-private partnerships. So just to summarize, metros good, yes. Buses also good, very much needed. Please have more buses.
Okay, thank you. That actually, what you said about poor urban planning reminded me of another thing I wanted to ask you, which is that I read somewhere, I think in your document only as well as in some report, that Indian cities have some of the lowest floor space index limits in the world. How do
Yeah.
those restrictive land use policies that you were talking about contribute to the way urban sprawl takes place, as well as the really, really high real estate prices that exist? Like Bombay, I know, is now unaffordable. And I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
because of that, the city also gets more and more dense and dwellings get smaller and smaller.
Yeah, India has really low FSI. FSI, like you said, is floor space index, which tells you how much built-up area how much area you can build on a specified plot of land, right? So the more the FSI, the more you can build on, which really translates to the higher the building can be. And the more people that live in in one building or in a small plot of land, means the more people that can access, say, a part of the land that is closer to the city center, that is closer to great amenities. The more people can access these amenities, the transportation costs reduce, the urban sprawl reduces, etc. So when you don't allow cities to grow tall, right, but people coming to the cities still remain the same, what they have to do is they have to settle further and further away from the city center, which means they have to travel from that area to the city center to work, for example, for to access those amenities, for to shops, to markets, to malls, to parks, to whatever, right? And then what happens is, as the city expands, it becomes bigger and bigger. Then infrastructure provision, say even water pipelines or roads, you have to build much more roads for all these people. You have to, the per mile cost of water provision, sewage provision, waste management increases. When the city becomes bigger, it starts to use agricultural land, right? Then
Yeah.
that land could actually be used in a much more productive way to do agriculture. But then that is sold, and people build houses there, and then it just isn't used as productively. But what also happens is that even though the city center, say, is not allowed to grow as tall, people still want to live there. So what that does is that increases the cost of housing, and because more and more people want to live there, the sizes of houses also decreases. Right. So in India, the housing space per capita is also really low compared to other cities, and real estate prices is higher. So this is kind of contradiction, or like a paradox, that you have smaller houses which are also expensive. So that's why we really need to increase the amount of space, housing space, real estate, for even commercial space near the city center. So, and that's why we need to allow cities to become tall. What it also does is that increases the use case of public transport, right? So now that when you have larger amount of people living in the same amount of land, now they need, a larger amount of people need to be moved from one place to another, which then increases the use case for metros, for buses, BRTS, etc. So this kind of everything comes together, like the puzzle pieces fit into each other. So that's why a good strategy to use is transit oriented development. So you develop these metro lines, or you develop these BRTS lines, and then along these lines you allow the city to grow taller. I think we are seeing that in some cities. I think Mumbai does that. I think Bangalore does that. That the FSI you get along the metro lines is much higher than you get anywhere else. Nevertheless, it needs to be much higher everywhere. Or what some other cities do across the world is that they have a central business district in which the FSIs are, they just have no cap. You can have skyscrapers, you can have really really tall buildings, which kind of creates a downtown into which people can move, right, to work, to stay, whatever, to set up their shop. So that is another strategy that we can use. Yeah. So you don't allow cities to grow tall, city expands, but at the market for houses in the city center still remains the same. So houses become small, houses become expensive. At the same time, the city takes up agricultural land. It becomes much more expensive to provide infrastructure, to provide transport, much more expensive for people to move from one place to another. So to solve all this, India just needs to increase the FSI, allow cities to grow tall, and the environmental impacts from this for this can be managed, right? And actually, if you see, suburban areas in the US, for example, have a much larger environmental impact than do city areas. So yeah, so that's what India really needs to do.
So I think one obvious issue that seems to be there in India is poorer urban governance, which is something I was thinking about compared to their global counterparts. I think the mayor equivalents in Indian cities,
Yeah,
have much less power. So, what
right.
would you say the structural changes are that are required to empower these local governments to be able to bring about better reforms?
Right. So the local government in India was established by the 73rd and 74th Amendment, right? And in that, the states were given a lot of power to decide how much power they really wanted to devolve to, urban local government. So states really have the other authority on that. And this creates a paradox in which the state governments are the entity who don't want to relinquish power, and they have the power to not relinquish that power, right? So a lot of cities in India, mayor equivalents, or whatever, the head of the local government, the head of the municipal corporation, municipality, nagarpalika, are not empowered. So there's a list of 18 functions that urban local government needs to do that are not devolved to them. I think Kerala is a good example of having good powers, the mayor having powers, but most other states are not. A lot of the functions that really the municipal corporation should control are controlled by the municipal commissioner, who is a bureaucrat appointed by the state government, right? So the states really need to devolve these powers to municipal corporations. Elections need to be more regular. There needs to be stated, stable, longer mayoral tenures, like there are, so say 5 years. So even the state government even has the authority to decide that, how long the tenure should be. And there should be like really be a set standard on what these tenures should be. There really needs to be a set standard of how these elections need to be conducted, because the local government elections are also conducted by the state election commission, which is controlled by the state government. So everything that the local government does is basically controlled by the state government, right? um, so once the mayor has more powers, he has a fixed kind of idea about how long they will be in power. They'll tend to engage more with citizens. They'll have clear accountability measures. So what happens right now is the mayor is elected by the people, but the mayor has no power. The municipal commissioner is appointed by the state government, and he or she has a lot of the powers, right? So the one who's elected has accountability but no power, and the one who has power has no accountability to the people. So this paradox really needs to be solved. Yeah.
Okay, that is both heartening that there are examples like Kerala, but also really confusing to see. In terms of learning from successful case studies, like in terms of devolving power, we can look at Kerala. I was also thinking of how, cities like Jamshedpur have found success through innovative governance and planning. What did
Right.
you other Indian cities could learn from them and better implement across the board?
Yeah, yeah. So Jamshedpur is really kind of an anomaly or an exception to the rule, because it's a totally private city, right? It's run by one single company who really built that city from the ground up, to house their own, workers, to house their own executives, and really drove growth there as and how they wanted. And that's a good example of for accountability. So the company that these people worked in also controlled kind of the function of the city. So these people who were getting, really had access to the government structures, or had access to the mayor kind of person there, and that's why that person is accountable, the company is accountable, and it wanted to keep its workers happy so that they would continue working in its plants. And so there's this really good incentive for the company to actually invest in the betterment of the city. However, I don't know if this kind of a private city is really a good model for India to follow, in the future. But this kind of accountability is something that other cities really need to learn. But there are other cities, not whole cities in general, but smaller parts of cities like Cyberabad, which is the IT tech park hub of near Hyderabad, which was a really good example of successfully implemented public-private partnerships. The government really consulted a lot of the private sector, and tried to understand what they wanted, and then built infrastructure in that way to so that there was this kind of give and take between what was good for the growth of the city and what was good for the government and what they could provide, right? So there's again this one single nodal agency. It was controlled by the state government, yes, but because it was this one single nodal agency who had stake in the game to better the city, it actually did good, and it actually provided a lot of the infrastructure that the private sector needed, and then executed that in a good way. So I think that having a good single nodal agency, and the municipal corporations need to be that, can really help. And then again, public-private partnerships, engage with the private sector. There's a really good World Bank document which talks about how local governments need to engage with the private sector, right? They need to understand what their needs are, need to understand what they need to succeed there, what they need to grow, and then provide that infrastructure. And that creates a good feedback loop for the private sector and also for the government. So I think that's something we need to learn. There's other examples of Gurgaon, but that was not developed by one single nodal agency. That had a really mismatch between the municipal corporation, the Haryana Urban Development Authority, the private sector. No one really provided infrastructure that the private sector wanted. The accountability and power, functions were mismatched. So we also learned from that, right? So that was a kind of innovation. It wasn't as successful initially. Now it's blossomed into good town, but there's still a lot of problems, right? But yeah, this is something we can learn.
Thank you for that, Mihir. I mean, it's been a lot of looking at both successes and failures, as well as identifying the issues that currently serve as roadblocks. And once they're addressed, then perhaps we could be in a better place. I just
Yeah.
have one last and kind of general question for you. But if there were no restrictions and you could propose one really bold reform that could fundamentally change India's cities in the next decade, what would it be?
Hmm.
What do you think
Hmm.
you'd focus on?
Okay, interesting question. So there's this debate about, can anything happen if the 73rd and 74th Amendment is not changed, right? So if the local governments are not, freed from the shackles of the state government, can they really invest well in, the growth of the city? Can they really, provide that kind of infrastructure? Can they be able to raise finances? But I think one solution that I would propose is that the Finance Commission should directly allocate money to the local governments, right? So then the local governments won't need to depend on the state government for for a lot of their money. They can invest in infrastructure. They can invest in basic infrastructure. They can better the job prospects. They can attract more industries. They can attract more people in the way that they want, and these policies can really come from the ground up. So then the finance commission can also set a good structure for good performance parameters about how they are using their money, about how well these municipal corporations are doing, and then they can grow. They can have that feedback. So I think that's one. I don't think it's as radical as probably you were hoping for, but I think it's something that is very necessary for the development. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. And like, no, it wasn't like ground shatteringly radical, but I think it's important to come up with proposing new ideas and hope that some of them will be implemented because it's obviously time for a change. And I think that's one really good idea going forward. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for your time.
No problem, Adya. It was a pleasure.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.